Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at the castles of Ireland, an island roughly the size of the American state of Indiana, which contains somewhere in the region of 30,000 castles and castle ruins. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shaped the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why, and what it actually cost to build something meant to last forever. Some of these stories are about walls and monuments still standing. Others are about entire systems of government and belief that vanished centuries ago, yet somehow still shape how we live, how we're governed, and even the words we use, without most of us ever realizing it. 30,000 is not a typo, and it is the highest density of fortified structures anywhere in Europe and very probably anywhere on Earth. Drive across almost any part of the Irish countryside and you will pass ruined towers standing in fields, half collapsed, ivy-covered, unmarked, unvisited, and frequently unnamed on any map. There is a specific reason for that density, and it is one of the most unusual pieces of legislation in medieval European history. In 1429, the government in Dublin passed a law offering anyone who built a castle of a specified minimum size a cash payment of £10. They were, quite literally, subsidizing castles. By the end of this episode you will know why that law existed, what it produced, what the difference is between a keep and a tower house and a bound, why the vast majority of Irish castles are not the great stone fortresses of the imagination, how gunpowder ended the whole thing, and where two English phrases you use regularly came from. And there is a wider argument running underneath, which I will make at the end, that the number of castles in a country is not a measure of its power. It is very often a measure of the absence of it. Let's begin before castles existed here at all, because Ireland had a fortification tradition long before the Normans arrived. The dominant structure of early medieval Ireland was the ring fort, known as a rath when built of earth and a cashel when built of stone. These were circular enclosures, typically 30 meters or so across, defined by a bank and ditch or a stone wall, containing a farmstead. They were not military fortresses. They were defended farms, protecting people and cattle from raiding, and cattle raiding was the characteristic form of Irish warfare for centuries. There are an enormous number of them. Estimates commonly run between 30 and 45,000 identified sites, and they are still visible across the countryside as circular banks and pasture, frequently left undisturbed by farmers because of a persistent folk belief that they belong to the fairies and that interfering with them brings misfortune. That superstition has probably preserved more Irish archaeology than any legislation. There were grander sites too. Duaneamhasa, on the edge of a cliff on Inishmore in the Aran Islands, is a prehistoric stone fort whose walls end at a 300-foot drop into the Atlantic, and whose approaches are defended by a field of upright stones set in the ground to break a charge. Staig Fort in Kerry and the Grianan of Aileach in Donegal are massive drystone enclosures built without mortar. But none of these are castles in the sense that word acquires later, and the reason is political. Early medieval Ireland had no centralized monarchy of the kind developing in England and France. It was organized into a large number of small kingdoms, with over-kings above them and, at the top, a high kingship that was frequently contested and often more ceremonial than real. Power was personal, dispersed, and fluid. There was no crown with the authority to license and control fortification, and no single state whose territory needed defending as a unit. Then came the Vikings, and they changed the map without building a single castle. Raids began in the 790s, and by the 9th century Norse forces were establishing fortified riverside camps called longforts as permanent bases. Several became towns, and this is the crucial contribution. Ireland's first true towns were Norse foundations. Dublin, whose name derives from an Irish phrase meaning black pool, dates its foundation as a settlement to the 840s. Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick were all Viking towns. Gaelic Ireland was rural and dispersed. The Norse built walled ports oriented toward trade, and in doing so created the urban network that everything afterwards would fight over. The Norse were substantially absorbed over time, and their power in Ireland was checked at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where the forces of Brian Boru defeated a Norse and Leinster alliance, though Brian himself was killed. The Hiberno-Norse remained as a merchant population in the towns. Now, 1169, and the year castles arrive in Ireland. The immediate cause was a dispute among Irish kings. Diarmaid mac Murchada, king of Leinster, had made powerful enemies, in part through his involvement in the abduction of the wife of a rival king, and by 1166 he had been driven out of Ireland altogether. He went to Henry II of England seeking help, obtained permission to recruit, and found his men among the Norman lords of Wales, most importantly Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known to history as Strongbow. The bargain was that Strongbow would receive Diarmaid's daughter Aoife in marriage and the succession to Leinster. Norman forces landed in Wexford in 1169. Waterford fell in 1170, and Strongbow married Aoife there. Dublin fell shortly afterwards. It worked far better than Diarmaid had intended, and it alarmed Henry II, who had no wish to see an independent Norman kingdom established across the sea. In 1171 Henry crossed to Ireland in person with a substantial force, received submissions from Norman lords and from a number of Irish kings, and asserted overlordship. That is the beginning of 8 centuries of English and later British involvement in Ireland, and it began as a mercenary contract in a provincial succession dispute. The Normans brought with them a technology that changed what was possible, and it was not stone. It was the motte and bailey. The design is simple. You raise a large mound of earth, the motte, and put a timber tower on top of it. Beside it you enclose a larger area at ground level, the bailey, with a ditch and a palisade, holding the hall, stables, workshops, and stores. The whole thing is surrounded by a ditch, and the earth from the ditch builds the mound. Its virtue is speed. A motte and bailey could be raised by forced local labor in weeks rather than years, and it required no masons, no quarry, and no lime. It could be built where the army happened to be standing. And what it delivered was strategically decisive. A small garrison in a motte and bailey could dominate the surrounding countryside, because it could not be taken by the kind of force a local lord could raise quickly, and it gave mounted troops a secure base from which to ride out. The Normans built these across Ireland in enormous numbers through the late 12th and 13th centuries, and hundreds survive as grassy mounds and fields, frequently mistaken for natural features. The timber was then progressively replaced with stone, and that produced the great Anglo-Norman castles. Let's look at the most significant of them. Trim Castle in County Meath is the largest Anglo-Norman castle in Ireland, covering roughly 3 acres. Hugh de Lacy built a timber fortification there in 1172, which was burned almost immediately, and stone construction began in the 1170s and continued over decades. Its keep is genuinely unusual. Rather than the standard rectangular tower, it is a cruciform structure with projecting towers on each face, producing a 20-sided building. The design gave defenders angles of fire along the walls, and it is not quite like anything else. The curtain walls, gatehouses, and barbican survive substantially, and modern visitors will recognize it, because much of the film Braveheart was shot there in 1994. Carrickfergus Castle in County Antrim was begun around 1177 by John de Courcy, a Norman lord who had invaded Ulster essentially on his own initiative. It sits on a rock projecting into Belfast Lough, and it is among the best preserved Norman castles in Ireland. Its remarkable feature is its career. It was besieged repeatedly across the centuries, held at various times by Irish, English, Scottish, and French forces, and it remained in continuous military use as a garrison until 1928. Very few castles anywhere were still on active military strength in the 20th century. Dublin Castle was ordered by King John in 1204, built at the corner of the city walls beside the Black Pool that gave Dublin its name. It became the administrative centre of English and then British government in Ireland, and remained so for over 700 years, until it was handed over to the new Irish state in 1922. Most of what stands today is 18th century, following a serious fire, but the medieval record tower survives, and the excavated base of a medieval tower can be seen beneath the modern buildings. King John's Castle in Limerick guards a crossing of the Shannon and retains a very fine gatehouse and towers. Excavations there uncovered the remains of siege works, including a mine and countermine from the sieges of the 17th century, which are now displayed underneath the castle, a rare chance to look directly at the physical evidence of one army tunneling toward a wall and another tunneling to intercept them. Cahir Castle in County Tipperary, a Butler stronghold on an island in the River Suir, is one of the largest and best preserved in Ireland, and it retains its original portcullis, which is rare. Embedded in the wall of the keep is a cannonball, left where it struck during the siege of 1599 when the Earl of Essex brought artillery against it. It is worth seeking out, because it is the single clearest illustration of what ended the age of castles. Now, the distinctively Irish contribution, and the reason for that 30,000 figure. The Tower House. A tower house is a compact, tall, stone residence, typically 3 to 5 stories, usually rectangular, with very thick walls, small windows, a single defended doorway, and a stone-vaulted ceiling over the ground floor. It housed a lord and his household. It was defensible against raiding and against a local force without artillery, and it was not designed to withstand a royal army. Somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 of these were built in Ireland, mostly between about 1400 and 1650, and they were built by everybody: Gaelic Irish lords, Anglo-Norman families, and the Hiberno-Norman aristocracy alike. Which brings us back to the law of 1429. By that date, English authority in Ireland had contracted severely. The area under effective control had shrunk to a region around Dublin, and the countryside beyond was dangerous, with raiding a constant feature of life. So the Parliament sitting in Ireland under Henry VI enacted a subsidy. Any liege man who built a castle within the defended area, of at least 20 feet by 16 feet in plan and 40 feet in height, within 10 years, would receive £10 from the government. These became known as £10 castles, and the specified dimensions correspond closely to a great many surviving tower houses. The scheme was a direct admission of state weakness. A government that cannot police its own territory can instead pay private individuals to fortify themselves and hold their own ground, effectively subcontracting defense to whoever will take the money. The form spread far beyond the subsidized area, because it suited the conditions everywhere. Ireland in the 15th and 16th centuries had no single effective central authority, considerable local autonomy, and endemic small-scale warfare, and the Tower House is precisely the building that circumstance produces, cheap enough for a minor lord, strong enough for the threats he actually faced. Let's go through the features, because once you know them you can read any ruin you pass. The ground floor is usually stone-vaulted. This is structural, and it is also fireproofing, since an attacker's first move is burning the door. Above the vault the floors were timber, which is why almost every ruined tower house is a hollow shell today. The stone survives and the wooden floors have gone. There is one entrance, and it is defended. Immediately inside, and above, there is frequently an opening in the ceiling of the entrance passage known as a murder hole, through which defenders could drop stones or pour water on anyone attacking the door. The water is the more likely use, since the intention was to extinguish fires set against the timber. The door itself was often protected by a yett, an iron grille of interlaced bars. The stairs are usually a stone spiral in the thickness of the wall, and they generally rise clockwise. It is widely said that this was designed so that a right-handed defender fighting downward had freedom for his sword arm, while an attacker coming up had the newel post in the way. That explanation is repeated everywhere. It is also disputed by a number of historians, who point out that spirals sometimes run the other way, that not everyone is right-handed, and that construction convention may explain most of it. It is a good story and it may well be partly true, but treat it as a suggestion rather than a fact. Some tower houses include a trip step, a single step of a different height in the stair, on the theory that residents know it and an intruder in the dark does not. At the top there are frequently bartizans, small turrets projecting from the corners at parapet level, allowing defenders to see and shoot along the base of the walls. And around the tower stands the bound, from an Irish word meaning cattle enclosure. This was a walled yard, sometimes with corner towers, containing outbuildings and, crucially, providing somewhere to drive the livestock during a raid. In a society where wealth was measured in cattle, the bound was often the point of the whole exercise. Many bound walls have vanished, which is why so many tower houses now stand alone in a field looking oddly isolated. It is worth pausing on what living in one of these was actually like, because the reality is less romantic than the silhouette. A tower house was cramped, dark, cold, and smoky. The windows were small because a large opening is a weakness, so the interior was dim even at midday, lit by rushlights and candles. Heating came from open fireplaces, and while later towers have proper flues, smoke was a constant. The layout was vertical rather than horizontal, which meant that everything involved stairs. The ground floor, under the vault, was storage. It frequently had no external window at all and was used for provisions, and sometimes for holding prisoners. Above that came a hall, where the Lord conducted business, ate, and received people. Above that, private chambers. And at the top, the parapet walk. Sanitation was provided by a garderobe, a small chamber built into the wall thickness with a seat over a shaft discharging outside, generally into the base of the wall, or a ditch. The ammonia was believed to deter moths, which is why clothing was sometimes stored nearby, and which is the origin of the word wardrobe. Furniture was sparse and largely portable. Lords moved between properties, and possessions moved with them: chests, trestle tables, hangings on the walls for warmth. The great carved fixtures people imagine are largely a later fashion. Sleeping arrangements were communal for almost everyone. The lord and his wife might have a private chamber. The household slept in the hall. And the population inside was substantial: family, guests, servants, and armed retainers, in a building with a footprint smaller than a modern detached house. The thing to hold in mind is that this was not a castle in the sense of a garrison fortress. It was a home that could be defended, occupied continuously by a family and their household, in which the defensive features were part of ordinary domestic life in the way that locks and alarms are today. Now, the culture that built them, because something interesting was happening. The Norman families who arrived in the 12th century did not remain Norman. Over generations they intermarried with Irish families, adopted the Irish language, patronized Irish poets, followed Irish legal custom, and became local dynasties with Irish alliances and Irish interests. The phrase used of them, in Latin, is that they became more Irish than the Irish themselves. The government's response was the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366, a body of legislation attempting to prevent exactly this. Among other provisions, it prohibited intermarriage between the English of Ireland and the Irish, forbade the English in Ireland to use the Irish language, Irish names, Irish dress, or Irish styles of writing, and barred the use of Irish Brehon law. The statutes were, in practical terms, a failure. They were reenacted and reissued, which is generally a reliable indicator that legislation is not working, and the assimilation continued. But they tell you exactly how the territory was understood, and they lead to the second of our two English phrases. The area around Dublin that remained under effective English control was known as the Pale, from the Latin word for a stake, meaning a fence or boundary. It was, at times, physically marked with ditches and banks. Inside the Pale, English law and custom held. Outside it, they largely did not. To be beyond the Pale is to be outside that boundary, and the phrase has carried a sense of being outside the limits of acceptable conduct ever since. Now, a selection of individual castles worth knowing, because several have stories attached that are worth the telling. Blarney Castle in County Cork was built in its present form in 1446 by Cormac later McCarthy. It is a large and well-preserved tower house, and set in the battlements is a block of limestone which, according to tradition, confers eloquence on anyone who kisses it. Doing so requires lying on your back and leaning out over a drop, held by an attendant, which is a considerable act of faith in exchange for a rhetorical gift. The word blarney entered English meaning smooth, flattering, persuasive talk that does not commit to anything. The traditional explanation is that Elizabeth I, repeatedly frustrated by a McCarthy lord who responded to demands that he surrender his lands with elaborate, charming, and entirely evasive replies, eventually exclaimed that it was all blarney and meant nothing. That story is traditional rather than documented, and the stone's supposed origins have accumulated a great many competing legends. But the word is genuinely in the language, and it genuinely comes from the place. Dunluce Castle in County Antrim stands on a basalt outcrop above the sea, connected to the mainland by a narrow bridge, and it is one of the most dramatically sited ruins in Europe. It was held by the Macquillans and then by the Macdonalds. There is a famous story that in 1639 part of the kitchen collapsed into the sea during a storm, carrying servants with it, and that the lady of the castle refused to live there afterwards. The tale is repeated constantly. Historians have questioned the details, and the archaeology of the site does not straightforwardly support the version usually told, so treat it with caution. What is certain is that the sea has taken parts of the site, and that a whole 17th century town beside the castle was excavated in recent decades, revealing streets and houses nobody knew were there. Ross Castle sits on the shore of Loch Lean in Killarney, a 15th century O'Donoghue Tower house. During the Cromwellian campaign, it was among the last places in Munster to hold out. Tradition held that it could never be taken until ships appeared on the lake, and the story goes that the parliamentarian commander Edmund Ludlow had boats transported overland and floated on the water, at which point the garrison, believing the prophecy fulfilled, surrendered. The castle did fall in 1652, and the story of the boats appears in accounts of the campaign, though how much of the prophecy element is later embellishment is impossible to establish. Bunnerty Castle in County Clare is the tower house most visitors see, and it is worth understanding why it looks so complete. Built around 1425 by the McNamaras and later held by the O'Briens, it fell into ruin, and was then bought and comprehensively restored in the 1950s by Lord Gort, working with the antiquarian John Hunt, who furnished it with a genuinely important collection of medieval furniture and fittings gathered from across Europe. It is the best place in Ireland to see what the interior of a tower house actually felt like, and it is not a fantasy reconstruction. Kilkenny Castle was held by the Butler family, earls and later Dukes of Ormond, from 1391 until 1967, an unbroken tenure of well over 500 years. When the family finally relinquished it, they sold it to a local restoration committee for £50, which is one of the better property transactions in Irish history. And the Rock of Cashel, while not a castle in the strict sense, belongs in any account of this. It is a limestone outcrop in Tipperary that was the seat of the Kings of Munster, granted to the church in 1101, and it carries a cathedral, a round tower, and Cormac's Chapel, a Romanesque church of the 1130s containing rare surviving medieval frescoes. A royal fortress handed over to the church and turned into an ecclesiastical complex is an unusual sequence, and the silhouette on the rock is one of the defining images of Ireland. So what ended all this? Before that, it is worth understanding how these places were actually attacked, because the popular image is largely wrong. Castles were rarely stormed. Assaulting a defended wall is enormously costly in lives, and a competent commander avoided it. The overwhelming majority of successful sieges ended in one of three ways: starvation, negotiation, or treachery. Starvation was the standard method. You surround the place, cut it off, and wait. This is why the bound and the storage vault mattered so much, and why a castle's water supply was the single most important feature of its site. It is also why sieges were often decided by whether a relief force was coming, and how soon. Negotiation was extremely common and was governed by conventions that seem strange now. A garrison that surrendered on terms before an assault was generally permitted to march out with its lives and sometimes its arms. A garrison that refused terms and was then taken by storm could expect no mercy, and that was understood by both sides as the normal rule rather than as an atrocity. It sounds barbaric, and it was, but it existed for a functional reason. It gave defenders a strong incentive to give up before a costly assault, which saved lives on both sides more often than not. Treachery accounted for a remarkable number of Irish castles. In a country of shifting alliances and intermarriage, a garrison very often contained someone with a connection to the besiegers, and gates were opened from the inside more frequently than walls were breached from the outside. Mining was used against major stone castles, tumbling under a wall or tower, propping the excavation with timber, then burning the props so that the tunnel collapses and takes the wall with it. The remains of exactly this at Limerick, along with the countermine dug to intercept it, can still be seen. And the everyday reality for most tower houses was not siege at all. It was the raid, a party arriving to take cattle, and a household withdrawing behind a door with the livestock in the bound until they went away. Most of these buildings never faced an army. They faced neighbors. Gunpowder, and then a state powerful enough to use it systematically, is what ended them. A tower house is designed against a raiding party with ladders and fire. It is not designed against artillery. Thick stone walls, which are excellent against a battering ram, are relatively brittle against sustained cannon fire, and high walls present a large target. The Tudor conquest through the 16th century brought that firepower to bear, and the 9 Years' War, from 1594 to 1603, was the decisive contest. The Gaelic lords of Ulster under Hugh O'Neill and Hugh O'Donnell inflicted serious defeats on English forces, but the campaign ended in defeat at Kinsale in 1601, and the war concluded with submission. In 1607, the leading Ulster earls left Ireland for the continent, an event known as the Flight of the Earls, and the plantation of Ulster followed, with land granted to settlers from Britain, and with fortified bounds and houses built across the province as part of the settlement. Then came Cromwell. The Cromwellian campaign of 1649 to 1653 brought a professional army with a modern siege train to a country full of medieval fortifications. Drogheda and Wexford were stormed with very heavy loss of life, and those events remain among the most bitterly remembered in Irish history. Militarily, the campaigns systematically reduced castles across the country, and many that were captured were then slighted, meaning deliberately damaged so that they could never be defended again. Walls were breached, towers were undermined, and gatehouses were destroyed. A great many of the ruins standing in Irish fields today are not the work of time. They are the work of demolition teams in the 1650s. The Williamite War of 1689 to 1691 produced the last major sieges: the Siege of Derry, the Boyne, the sieges of Athlone and Limerick. After the Treaty of Limerick in 1691, the age of the castle in Ireland was militarily over. Artillery had won, and the country had a single dominant power that no local lord could resist. What followed was the penal era, in which Catholic landowning was progressively restricted, and the great estates of the 18th century took shape. The new elite did not build castles. They built country houses, undefended, with large windows, symmetrical facades, and parkland, because they had no need to defend anything. Then, curiously, the castle came back, as a fashion. From the later 18th century and through the 19th, Romantic medievalism produced a wave of castellated houses, comfortable modern residences dressed in battlements, towers, and arrow-slit-shaped windows that no archer had ever used. Ashford Castle in County Mayo grew from a genuine 13th-century de Burgo foundation into a vast Victorian mansion under the Guinness family, and is now one of Ireland's best-known luxury hotels. Dromoland in Clare, the seat of the O'Briens, descendants of Brian Boru, was rebuilt in castellated style and is likewise a hotel. Charleville, Humewood, and dozens of others followed the fashion. Cowmore Abbey in Connemara is the most striking. It was built from 1868 by Mitchell Henry, a wealthy doctor and politician, for his wife Margaret, after they had visited the area on honeymoon. She died young, and he built a small Gothic church on the estate in her memory. The house passed eventually to a community of Benedictine nuns who had been displaced from Belgium during the First World War, and it became an abbey and a school. It is a castle built out of affection rather than fear, which makes it almost unique in this story. The 20th century was hard on all of it. Land reform transferred estates to tenant farmers, and the maintenance costs of enormous houses fell on families whose incomes had gone. During the War of Independence and the Civil War, between 1919 and 1923, a substantial number of country houses, commonly estimated at around 275, were burned. Others were abandoned, unroofed to avoid taxation, or quarried for stone. And then, from the middle of the century, the recovery began. The state took many sites into public care. Bunratty was restored in the 1950s. Trim, Caer, Carrickfergus, Dublin Castle, King John's Castle, and many more have been conserved and opened. Private owners have restored individual tower houses as homes, which is now a recognized and demanding branch of Irish building conservation. Thousands, though, remain exactly as they were, unroofed, unlabeled, standing in private fields, with no path to them and no sign. If you drive the back roads of Clare, Limerick, Tipperary, Galway, Cork, or Mayo, you will pass them continuously, and most have no visitor information because there are simply too many to interpret. Which brings us back to the argument I promised at the start. Before that, a practical note, since a great many people watching will at some point stand in front of one of these. If you want the full experience of a great Anglo-Norman castle, Trim and Carrickfergus are the two to see, and Trim in particular because the scale of the enclosure only registers when you walk it. For a tower house interior as it would actually have been furnished, Bunratty is unmatched. For sheer drama of setting, Dunluce-on-Sea Stack has no rival in Ireland. Caer gives you the portcullis and the cannonball, which together tell the whole story of the technology and its end. Ross Castle at Killarney and Blarney give you fine tower houses in beautiful settings, and Kilkenny and Dublin Castle show you what happens when a medieval fortress keeps being lived in and rebuilt for 700 years. But the ones that stay with people are usually the unlisted ones. Ireland has thousands of tower houses with no car park, no ticket desk, and no sign, standing in fields. Two things are worth saying about those. The first is that they are almost always on private land, and standing in someone's pasture without asking is trespass. Farmers in Ireland are generally welcoming if you knock and ask, and generally less welcoming if you climb a gate. The second is that ruined masonry is genuinely dangerous. These structures have no roofs, unstable wall heads, hidden shafts where garderobes and stairs have collapsed, and loose stone. People are injured in them every year. Look, photograph, and stay out of the interior unless it is a maintained site. We tend to read castles as symbols of power. A great fortress looks like the expression of a strong ruler, and in some countries that is exactly what it is. Ireland shows you the opposite, and it shows it at scale. Ireland has more castles than England, France, or Spain, all of which were far wealthier and far more powerful. It has them because it lacked what those countries had, a single authority strong enough to keep the peace across its own territory. In a state with effective central power, fortification is a royal monopoly, licensed and restricted, because a king does not want his subjects able to defy him from behind walls. In Ireland for centuries, no such power existed. English authority was real near Dublin and intermittent elsewhere. Gaelic lordship was genuine but local. Nobody could guarantee anybody's safety. So everyone with sufficient means built a tower and put a wall around the cattle. The 30,000 castles of Ireland are not 30,000 monuments to kings. They are 30,000 records of a country in which local families concluded, correctly, that no one was coming to help them. And in 1429, a government in Dublin looked at that situation, accepted it, and offered to pay £10 toward the walls. 600 years later, you can still see where the money went, standing in the fields. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below telling us which castles, cities, or institutions you would like us to explore next, and if you have visited any of the places in this episode, tell us which one.